name People's History, People's is self-evident. History, we end it EH, because that's how most local people would say, they say Histreh. So we decided just to make it personal to Nottingham, we'd actually spell it how people say it. The first event was in 1990, commemorating the 20th anniversary of the poll tax protest. And in 1990 there was a meeting at the City Council, had a meeting to set the rate. I think it would be the first one. And the meeting was taken over by protesters and occupied. Most notable, one of the most notable things from it was that several of the councillors were custard pied during the process of it. We've got our own publishing company, it's called Loaf on a Stick Press. We brought out 2 pamphlets and a proper book.
Is that the cheese riots?
I'll come to that, yeah. You see, they've had butter riots, we've had a cheese riot. The first pamphlet was about the 1831 reform riots in Nottingham, which resulted in the castle being burnt down. The second pamphlet was the Great Cheese Riot of 1766. But then again, I'd write for cheese. In a short while back, Chris here wrote a book that he asked us to publish. It's called A City of Light, Socialism, Chartism and Cooperation, Nottingham 1844. It is a good read actually as well. We've got a few others if anybody's interested in having a look, or maybe even buying one. And then the latest project is this. We're looking at the cases of 103 soldiers from the local regiment, the Sherwood Foresters as they were called at the time. These men were sentenced to death on mutiny charges during World War I, which is where I hand over to Philip, who's going to expand on that.
Okay, we got some random bits of propaganda we're going to hand out. And yeah, so oh shit, we are late, aren't we? But yeah, in preparation for today, I was thinking whether I should focus more on the overall project or on the actual individual cases themselves. But I thought, given the time frame, I couldn't do actually justice to the cases themselves. So all I'm going to do is quickly outline the project, which is going to run from now well into 2018. So quite a five-year plan, but it's probably as near as we're ever going to get to one. So I'm going to outline some of the underlying ideas and refer to some of the challenges we face. Please accept my apologies, but as I'm going to have to be even more brief, probably given the time, this will be quite superficial. David already said that what we are looking into are the cases of soldiers in the local regiment sentenced to death or sentenced on mutiny charges by courts-martial during World War I. It's a bit of a cumbersome sentence, but there is reasons why this has to be a bit precise, because otherwise, yeah, I would always issue it. We've so far identified 103 cases. 65 soldiers were convicted on mutiny charges. 38 others were sentenced to death for a number of offences, most of them for desertion. 8 out of those 38 were executed by firing squad. Regarding those 8 individuals, quite a lot of research has already been done over the decades. Essentially, Putowski and Sykes kicked off the whole Shot at Dawn campaign when they published their book in 1989. However, very, very little is known about those other 30 that got sentenced to death, but then their sentences got commuted in the aftermath. And with regards to the 65 sentenced for their alleged involvement in mutinies, our research had to literally start from scratch. There are a lot of complex issues surrounding a project like that. One of them, which also surprised me a bit, because growing up on the continent, kind of World War I is not as imminent in collective memory as it is over here. And so I was surprised that although those actively involved in the events are are now gone. Kind of many of their direct descendants are still around, their children, their grandchildren, their nieces, nephews, and so on. But even a generation further down the line, there's many people who feel an incredible personal and incredible close and very, very emotional connection to the period and to events in that period. And this has to be taken account, especially when working on a subject that's still so very much influenced by the social stigma that's associated with a so-called crime such as desertion. Being up against that stigma also seems to be the basis of a common narrative about military law and military law enforcement. Be it either out of personal convictions by folks who tell this story or for strategic consideration, the actions of the army are most of the time portrayed as injustices that need to be unveiled and corrected. And especially when criticizing the executions, people have often argued that those shot at dawn had also bravely done their bit for king and country, but they were then finally broken by the unimaginable hell of combat stress. The army didn't acknowledge that at the time and then shot them for desertion, cowardice, or similar offenses. The primary problem with this narrative is, of course, that it does not question the whole idea of doing your bit for queen, king, country, fatherland, and all that nonsense. What is being questioned is merely the so-called unjust conduct of the army at the time. And although I can understand why many people have taken this approach over the years, especially when they were pursuing an objective that required public support, we really want to avoid going down that route. And one of the consequences of that is, of course, that we don't really have any illusions of how much impact we could make to the overall debate. Also, even if we were focusing on a wide audience, our basic approach is simply not broadcastable, because our principal attitudes towards army and nation are fuck them. So that kind of makes it really, really hard to kind of enter the mainstream debate on this subject. So indeed, what I think is that the army's actions have nothing at all to do with justice, and they actually admit that themselves. This is a quote from the Manual of Military Law. Here's the 1907 version, and it states quite clearly, quote, "The object of military law is to maintain discipline among the troops," unquote. And that makes it very plain that military law and military law enforcement has nothing to do with determining an accused's guilt or innocence of whatever their so-called crime is they are standing trial for. Military law is simply another tool employed by the army to uphold discipline among the troops. Once you start looking into it, a term like discipline is actually a fairly complicated beast, but it may just be understand and boiled down to troops doing as they are told by their superiors. And by putting discipline at the center of military law, the army did exactly what it was set up to do. Condemning what happened to those ending up blindfolded against the wall therefore requires us to focus and condemn those very ideas and principles any nation's armed army is based on. Okay, right. So with regards to the death sentences, an awful lot could be said and should be said, but I can only make a couple of points here. So one thing we of course need to be aware of is that in this project we only focus on official cases. So that's people that were charged, tried, and sentenced by a court martial. And of course that's not the only folks that got executed by their own side. There is a large number of eyewitness accounts of officers or NCOs threatening to kill or indeed killing people that refuse to go over the top, machine gunning retreating troops, and all this kind of things. And at least in one of our cases, there are also reports of officers pulling their revolvers on troops to stop them retreating. The problem with that is that is not quantifiable. It happened, and it needs to be made very clear that it happened, and it wasn't an uncommon thing. But it's very, very hard to talk about these actual cases because they leave no paper trail, and very, very often, as a kind of someone shoots some of their own folks to get the others out of the trench. Everyone goes out of the trench. Seconds later, the shooter and all witnesses are mowed down by machine guns, and that kind of complicates looking into these kind of cases. So this chart, and yeah, you waited till the last talk to get statistics. So this chart shows the official death sentences and execution broken down per 100,000 troops abroad. So keep in mind that all the time the actual size of the overseas army is growing immensely. So at the beginning here in December 14, we got about 250,000, and at the end we got about 2.5 million. So the figures at the beginning represented an awful lot fewer cases than the figures at the end. But looking at this, and the one thing I want to do with this, what becomes clear is that in executing their troops, so in the red line at the bottom, the army actually sticks rather strictly to an almost Stalinist quota system. Whereas the figures for the death sentences does fluctuate quite a bit, and there's a big bunch of variables influencing that, and I really don't have time. The ratio of executions to overall troop numbers is remarkably stable. And this goes especially if we look at those middle period in the war. There's anomalies at the beginning and anomalies at the end, which can be explained. But especially in the middle here, 1916 and 1917, when the war's just grinding on and on and on from one bloody fiasco to the next, this is a remarkably stable line. And this aims to exemplify again that in their use of capital punishment, the army does not appear to have been driven by ideas of mercy or indeed of cruelty. They rather followed a very bureaucratic approach. They shoot just enough to make a point, but not so many as to turn fear into defiance. And in choosing whom to shoot, that's a very complex question, and also one of the reasons why we want to look in so much detail into the cases of those who get their sentences commuted. Well, it seems that those who actually get executed, in most cases, the army simply murders those where they are sure that they can't use them anymore. So those too traumatized carry on, those who've deserted a number of times, so those are the other ones that tend to get shot. If they think, and if the court-martial thinks, all right, he has a good record, we don't need to make an example because his unit is fairly disciplined, then what happens is they send them back into the trenches. So they usually don't even do jail time, also the death sentence gets commuted to something like 10 years prison sentence, and then that sentence gets suspended, keeping the folks actually in the trenches. And we got at least 2 or 3 cases of those 30 where they then don't survive the war, or one of them probably died of Spanish flu, but ask me again in 4 years. Right, mutinies. Between 1940 and 1922, we've got about 1,500 troops tried overseas on mutiny charges. Many of these prosecutions happened after the armistice has been signed. You can see like the really big blob there at the end. Indicating that what triggered these mutinies, or what triggered many of these mutinies, and I would make a case to differentiate between trigger and then what actually happens in while stuff is going on. But what triggered those was often the question of demobilization. And again, we are of course faced by the problem that these figures for official mutinies do not reflect the actual numbers of mutinies in the British Army. In fact, it may even be the case, and it looks at the moment, that charging mutinies for mutiny is the exception rather than the norm. There are a large number of reasons for this, one of them being that what constitutes mutiny is rather vaguely defined, and the decision whether or not to prosecute and execute troops on mutiny charges often has very little to do with actual events on the ground. Furthermore, there's of course a lot of officers that don't want to go on record of having been in command of a mutinous unit, so many people try to deal with the situation in alternative ways. Whilst they're in the middle of a massive war, there is of course a lot of alternatives to get rid of troublemakers. And also there is cases where it looks like concessions were made. And that actually points to some interesting ideas about treating many of those mutinies as a continuation of civilian labor disputes. I have to think about them more in terms of strikes than actual mutinous revolts. With regards to the mutiny in Foresters, there are 2 occasions where we've got convictions. The first is against a lone guy on the Western Front in late 1915, probably in response to him actually or allegedly trying but failing to incite a mutiny. The second event happened in Egypt, and this seems to be one of those examples where we got someone fairly low, some fairly low-ranking officer trying to hush things up, while someone else higher in the chain of command, for yet to determined reasons, is pushing things forward, and that ends in the sentencing of 64 foreign foresters who get all sentenced to 2 years hard labor, which is, if you look at the overall sentences that Mutiny gets, quite harsh. Not many mutinies actually get shot. I think it's only 3. And those 64 with their 2 years of hard labor are amongst those who get the harshest sentences. Well, that makes events in Kantara in June 1917, and that's that nice highlighted spike there, by far the biggest single set of mutiny convictions in the British Army before April 1918. So before that final German onslaught in the spring offensive. So we go through the whole war, and we got a fairly small number of convictions, and then we've got this anomaly here in Egypt, and we could already establish a lot of circumstantial evidence, but I am very much looking forward into that one, because it is for many reasons a very strange mutiny. Okay, right. Coming to the close, I try to outline that what we are very much concerned about is trying to avoid repeating many of the myths and cliches that surround this subject. Obviously, we don't want to retell the story of brave heroines and heroes doing their bit, pulling together in the face of despair and adversity. But we also want to make sure not to tell equally glorified tales of masses of brave revolutionaries stopping the war, which, as I think my outlook on this quantity or on the scale of resistance to World War was a bit gloomier than of some other people doing work in this field. Indeed, it's quite striking to me that despite the horrors of World War I, the respective war machines of the great powers just keep going on and on for such a long time. There are, of course, notable exceptions to this. You got the French army mutinies of 1917, you got, of course, the collapse of the Russian Empire. But, however, despite all the methodological problems and actually ascertaining levels of unrest in the British Army seems to have been remarkably successful in avoiding any serious breakdown of discipline throughout the war, however many blunders led from one bloodbath to another. There's definitely a point that can be made that after the armistice, the mass of unrest that happened then spoiled ambitions some had to commit the full force of the British Army fighting in Russia. But at least in that period between 1914 and November 1918, unrest in the British Army proved to be rather manageable. And even after the armistice, most mutinous Saran soldiers could be pacified by being demobilized. I am thoroughly depressed by this, but I think it may be unavoidable to face up to the tragedy that this was due to the vast majority of the troops staying disciplined and doing as they were told. It is crucial to state that discipline and enthusiasm are very different things, and that discipline was definitely given increasingly grudgingly, but discipline was upheld nevertheless. And I am with you that Live and Let Live is very, very interesting and was extremely widespread and was extremely prevalent and worried a lot of army commanders. But when I've been reading about those folks we are looking into, kind of, I've come across a number of recollections where someone talks about they entered the quiet sector. They were told by the ones going out, we've got an arrangement with the ones over there. We do not fire at each other at meal times because that's impolite. And we usually kind of warn each other before those loonies in the back fire heavy artillery. So that is definitely something that happens, and that's something that exists throughout the war and includes. And it seems to be that at one time or another, pretty much every soldier gets caught up in a sector where this is normal. But it seems that this is seen more as a reprieve, and as soon as they then get sent into an active sector again, or end up against one of those elite units, as was mentioned earlier, that do not fraternize. Other many Scottish regiments were quite known for being very reluctant to engage in live and let live. On the other side, everyone was hating the Prussians. Even a lot of the Germans was hating the Prussians, but that's also different. And saying kind of when you're up against them, they just keep killing you. But at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, it seems to be that even folks that weeks before in a different sector have been engaging in these informal truces, when they are told attack, at the end of the day they attack, and at the end of the day they do slaughter each other. And therefore, cases such as these, the 103 Foresters, seem to be fairly rare examples of active acts of disobedience. They're not at all unique, but they are rare. However, for me, that makes those stories not less crucial, but maybe even more so and even more worth telling. And we'll strive to find out as much as we can about those folks, their pre-war lives, their war experience, and of course, events resulting in the trials and their respective aftermath. This is our time plan. The idea is to take the dates of the trials as deadlines by which we want to have something ready for publication. It looks at present that we will issue a series of pamphlets over the next 4 years and then decide in the end whether we do something else with it. The first 2 pamphlets are quite ready and will probably still be published this side of Christmas. The first one will be an extensive introduction of what we do and blah, 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 and kind of essentially what I just said with many footnotes, because I do like footnotes. Yeah, if you ever get across one of our pamphlets, we do love a good footnote. But yeah, never mind. But the second one will look into our first case. That's up there, February 15, 1 death sentence commuted. We were able to find out quite a lot about this person but we had to look very extensively into the circumstantial evidence and the sources around him. And many of the details remain uncertain and probably will forever remain uncertain. And that's not just because I kind of insulted the military guy who runs the archive but yeah, it was a very innocent question anyway. It's not just because of that, but one massive problem we face, and that's a problem we will face time and again with these cases, is that my very own granddads and their Nazi chums did a very thorough job of blitzing London in 1940, not only killing tens of thousands, but also destroying an awful lot of records. So it's true, a lot was suppressed, a lot was destroyed afterwards, but a lot was just burned when the Germans came. And that is definitely, with case number 1, that is a big problem. So we found a lot about him, we found a lot about the circumstances, but for instance, it's going to be impossible to link the scraps of military records that survives back to civilian records simply because his name is too common and blah, 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 blah. And yeah, we tried all sorts, but never mind. In any case, you can see from that we've got an awful lot to do over the next few years, and I can only hope that you will keep an eye on our blog as for updates as we go along. So grab some propaganda of... Oh no, has that already come back to you? Oh, excellent. All right, then, thank you very much. And thank you very much.
Right, we're really running out of time, but we've got time for very, very quick questions then.
Yeah, could you just say a bit about the Egypt example? Because you just went
Shit. Yeah. Okay. It's I'm so hurried for time. Egypt example. So it's a strange mutiny because they get convicted for mutiny. That's incredibly strange, especially at this stage of the war, because no one gets convicted for mutiny, as you could see in that graph. It just doesn't happen. It happens behind the lines, whilst there is essentially what happens in Egypt is the British Empire is worried about the Suez Canal, and that it can't. They realize fairly quickly it can't be conquered because there's just no way you can get an army through the desert that can actually conquer Egypt. But you can get harassed on the canal, so they think, okay, where can we make a stable line of the canal where there's not some folks dropping mines into it all the time? And they think, okay, we'll take the fight into what's today Israel, and they establish and so they push forward, fight themselves through Sinai, and then it comes to a stalemate just outside modern day Gaza, and then there's these things that always happen, they storm over and they get mowed down, and they do that a few times, and then things stop for a while, and then they force a massive build-up of troops and materials. And during that massive build-up of troops and materials, there's these soldiers who mutiny. They are not from a combat unit, but from a rear guard unit who guard buildings, who possibly do some logistics, etc., etc. And at the moment, the theory is that they come down so hard on them because essentially everything goes through one railhead. Also, everything goes through one base and one railhead. And if you can't keep up supplies through that one rail line, then the whole front line will fall apart. And then something happens at that railhead, and then we've got these convictions. So it seems these folks there, if you think about it in terms of the strike, they've got an incredible power. Because they can shut down the whole operation. So something happens in the back, and then folks decide to come down very, very hard on them. However, the guy directly in command of the unit doesn't mention it with a single word. So he doesn't want to go as a captain, whatever the fact there was, but Captain Thingy doesn't want to go on record as having been in command of a mutinous unit. But someone higher up the line must have thought, okay, we'll crash down on this. Sources are going to be shit for that. My best hope at the moment is trying, because I know what prison they were sent into. So at the moment I'm trying to get my head around military prison sources, and then hopefully from there on find something more. Because again, what I have is trial dates, units, last name, initial, and that's all I have, and that's pretty shit to go on. But I am, a few obvious avenues have already been fucked up, but there's a few others I am still hoping for, and even not, then we can just write down a whole bunch of more or less speculative stuff.
Is that the only non-European campaign area, or of the 30 or 60 across the campaign?
That's the there is in every theatre of war you find these cases.
Yeah.
For our lot, that's the only one that's not in what the database calls France and Flanders.
That's what I wondered. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for pointing it out.
Yeah.